안녕하세요, 김지윤입니다. 오늘 책 소개와 함께 정말 고대하던 인터뷰를 준비를 했습니다. 한국에서 가장 좋아하는 정치 철학자 마이클 샌델 교수님 이번에 새로 내신 당신이 모르는 민주주의라는 책인데요. 이 책에 대해서 좀 더 심도 있게 알아보기 위해서 마이클 샌델 교수님과의 인터뷰를 지금부터 시작하겠습니다. Hello, Professor Sandel.
Hello, Shiyun. It's good to see you again.
2 years actually, the last time we met online, I think.
Are things getting back to normal now and after the pandemic?
Yeah, so you can fly to Korea and visit here. There are a lot of people waiting for you.
Well, I look forward to the next opportunity now that the restrictions have eased.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Sandel, for being with us today. And congratulations on your new book. It is a Korean version, The Democracy's Discontent. But this is not really the new book. It's actually an updated version that you published in 1996. So could you please briefly explain what the civic republicanism is and why it's so special in American tradition and how it is different from the liberalism? Because those who are not really familiar with the terms, they may confuse that republicanism is somehow connected to the Republican Party and the liberalism connected to the Democratic Party.
Thank you for posing that question because it's important to be clear. Liberalism is interpreted in many different ways. So I need to be clear what the story is about. It's really about two competing conceptions of freedom. The most familiar conception of freedom these days is the idea that I'm free insofar as I can act on my desires. This is the liberal conception of freedom. But my argument in the book is this can't be all that freedom means, getting what I want. It's a kind of consumerist idea of freedom. We are also citizens, which leads to the second conception of freedom that I distinguish and that I call the civic republican conception of freedom. According to this conception, to be free is to have a voice, to have a share in self-government. In the story of the book, of Democracy's Discontent, both of these understandings of freedom have been present throughout the American political tradition. And through much of the 19th and into the 20th century, the civic conception of freedom was the predominant one. And it gradually was displaced by the liberal conception of freedom. Now, how does this connect to Democracy's Discontent? I suggest many of the sources of discontent with democracy today has to do with the sense that we don't have a meaningful say in how we are governed. Our freedom of citizens has been eroded. Jiyun, what do you think? Does that make it clear enough, do you think?
Yeah, it is clear to me because I read the book and and I understood that in the beginning of the United States was established, the founding fathers had two different ideas. In one side, Hamilton, the other side, Jefferson and the Madison as well. And of course, Hamilton is the one we see right now, but Jefferson had a totally different idea about the United States to be. It seems like we are losing the Jeffersonian thought or tradition, which can be called, I understood, as a civic republicanism.
Yes.
It had been dominant until 20th century, and then it started to disappear, and now the liberalism is a dominant public philosophy. I know that you are critical of the liberalism of John Rawls, and so it's not putting the priority of the rights over the good, but you want to find the good to have the priority over the right. Is that right?
Yes, you've summarized it beautifully, Shiyun. But let me explain just to make sure people don't misunderstand. The liberalism I'm criticizing is not the idea of liberalism that often arises in politics where we see a debate between liberals and conservatives. Liberalism as a political philosophy that is connected with the idea of freedom I've just described, getting what I want rather than sharing in self-rule. That's the liberalism that I say too narrow a notion of freedom. So I'm trying to bring the civic understanding of freedom back in. Now, what does this have to do with liberalism in political philosophy, in the philosophy of John Rawls, in the idea, as you just put it, that the right is prior to the good. One way of explaining this is to suggest that, well, on my view, it's not possible for politics or for rights or for justice to be defined in a way that is neutral with respect to the common good. We have to debate with our fellow citizens about the meaning of the good life, about the meaning of civic virtue, because if you take seriously the civic conception of freedom, we have to reason together and argue together about common purposes and ends. Democratic citizenship requires this capacity. I'm critical, you're right, of the version of liberalism as a political philosophy that says politics and government must be neutral toward competing conceptions of the good life.
Well, maybe because we are so focused on the fair distribution, avoid those contentious issues that may arise among the people and the citizens. And I understand not just in this book, but from previous books on the justice and meritocracy, you mentioned clearly that part. The politics should not stay neutral.
Yeah, if I could just add one point, Shijun, I think even that discussion about what's a fair distribution must depend on what does it mean to seek the common good. But what I'm suggesting is those debates, in order to have meaning and significance, have to engage with citizens' competing moral convictions, competing conceptions of the common good. So it's tempting to say, let's try to avoid those messy, controversial debates about values, about ethics, about moral conviction. And I think we've seen this in recent decades. It leads to letting markets decide what counts as a fair distribution, letting markets decide what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. The deep appeal of markets, I think, especially in recent decades, is not only that they deliver prosperity and affluence. That's a strength of markets, kept within certain bounds. The deep appeal is the hope that markets can be neutral ways of deciding what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. And this connects with my earlier book on what money can't buy, the moral limits of markets.
I know you are not anti-market, but
Right.
seem to be very worried about the market or economic power transcending into other areas of the society, which is politics maybe, or
Right.
social issues. It seems that you are pointing out that the kind of tendency was emphasized and then started during the New Deal and the Keynesian economy.
I tell this story.
That was really fun. I love that part.
There was a broader conception of what an economy is for and what economic debate should be about. Let me give one example. Late 19th century, early 20th century, the progressive era, there was a lively debate in the United States as the country industrialized and as vast, powerful corporations emerged, the steel companies, the railroads. They dominated politics. They were dominating democracy. And it gave rise to the anti-monopoly, antitrust movement, the voice of ordinary citizens. Now, during the time of the New Deal and after, the purpose of antitrust policy changed. It came to be less and less about restoring democratic accountability and control over the economy. And it came to be more and more about avoiding monopolies because they tended to drive up consumer prices. So this shift illustrates the broader philosophical shift, two different ways of thinking about freedom, the liberal consumerist conception on the one hand, and the civic or Republican conception on the other. Two different ways of thinking about the economy.
But America invented another big power, big government.
Yes.
I'm probably one of them. Thought the Keynesian economic theory and also FDR and New Deal, these are all helping out the poor. It was an inevitable thing. But you think that was probably the moment that the American citizen transformed into the consumers. right?
Well, yes and no. And I want to be careful here because it's a complicated story. So, one of the truly great achievements of FDR and the New Deal was the creation of Social Security, a basic welfare state. But at the same time, FDR was torn between the old tradition of antitrust. FDR knew that the democracy will be endangered if the power of finance and big business becomes greater than the democracy can regulate. He knew that, and he instituted banking regulations. Some of the strongest financial regulations were put in place during the New Deal to prevent banks and big finance from dominating democracy. But, as you were pointing out just now, at the same time, other of his advisors were saying the fundamental solution to the Depression, which he inherited, is spending, the fiscal solution, Keynesianism, manipulating macroeconomic demand. And FDR also went along with those advisors. But I think it's important to recognize the other legacy of FDR and the New Deal, which remains relevant, especially today when we're struggling with repeated financial crises and with the power of banks and something FDR didn't have to worry about, the power of big social media and tech companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google, that questions are arising again today about whether government has the capacity to regulate them in the public interest.
I see. Well, I'd like to go back to the question of the neutrality. Let me take an example of abortion. So in 1973, the US Supreme Court had a decision on the Roe versus Wade the case. The woman can have an abortion, which called the trimester rule. You can say the politics or judiciary was engaging in this very contentious issue of abortion. So that should be the case, right?
That the judiciary should take sides in the debate about abortion. But, and this goes to the neutrality argument, although they were taking sides, the court claimed that it was being neutral on the question of when the developing fetus becomes a human person. It said, we as a court have to be neutral on that underlying moral and even theological question. The problem with the decision was not the result so much as the reasoning. Partly because of this, people sensed that it was disingenuous. Everybody knew that the court was not being truly neutral. And so now the current Supreme Court has struck down Roe v. Wade. And so now the states are free to decide for themselves how to regulate abortion. What's interesting is that both courts made a certain claim to neutrality. The 1973 court that upheld abortion rights said, but we're being neutral on the underlying question. We're just saying each woman should be able to decide that question for herself. And then the current court, they also said, we're being neutral. We're just leaving it to the states, each state to decide. We're being neutral, both claiming to be neutral. And I think this is an example of how the claim to be neutral on a deeply controversial moral question leads to bad faith and leads to resentment, especially among those who feel that their views have not been taken into account.
I know you have been very critical of particularly the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. You mentioned her twice in your previous book and this book again about her remarks, basket of deplorables, which was referring to Trump supporters during the 2016 presidential election campaign. I actually personally thought that was probably the clearest moment showing how the liberals were detached and disinterested in ordinary American public. Maybe it's not just the thing we see in the United States, but other countries as well, the UK, the France, I would say in Korea as well. So why did it happen?
Well, I agree with you that calling Trump supporters, or many of them, not all of them, she said, a basket of deplorables, gave expression to what many Trump supporters felt, which was that liberal elites looked down on them. And it is a striking feature of our politics that the Democratic Party today in the United States is largely the party of college-educated professional classes. Whereas the Republican Party increasingly is gaining support among voters without a college education. This represents a reversal of the historic pattern. So how did this happen? This is part of the story I try to tell in my book, The Tyranny of Merit, how credentialed professional elites came to define liberalism, were associated with the Democratic Party, and that many working people felt that liberal elites, professional elites, academic elites, the media looked down on them and didn't take seriously their frustrations and their grievances about being left behind after 4 decades of globalization. Now, what makes it a difficult question is many of those who voted for Trump were attracted by racism and the sexism and the misogyny and the xenophobia that Donald Trump appealed to. But I think it's a mistake to see only that source of support for figures like Trump, because that leads political elites to neglect the legitimate grievances after 4 decades of wage stagnation, job loss, and an economic system that actually gave most of its rewards to those on top, to the top 10 or 20% over a 40-year period in the United States. And the Democratic Party was no longer really defending their interests.
I think that is really well analyzed. You also mentioned that in the book. It's well analyzed by Piketty. Before his book was out, I actually read an article in 2018. The title was Brahman Left versus Merchant Right. And it is explaining how Donald Trump was able to be elected and also the Brexit. In both cases, as you correctly pointed out, the liberals and the left are more interested in other issues, such as environmental issues, same-sex marriage, or immigration. Then they are not defending the traditional interest of their traditional supporters, the lives of the blue-collar workers.
Yes, I would add just one small qualification, Ji-yoon, which is I think that environmentalism and climate change and same-sex marriage, I do think these are issues that affect everyone, regardless of their economic class. I don't think that political leaders or parties should give up on that project. But what I do think is missing is a serious attention by liberal professional elites and the center-left parties, serious attention to the legitimate grievances of working people having to do not only with wage stagnation and rising inequality, but also the lack of recognition for the dignity of work made by many of our fellow citizens who do not have university diplomas. But I think we need to reorient the economy and our political discourse in a way that affirms and renews the dignity of work. Because until that happens, working people will continue to feel alienated from a political project that seems to focus on other issues while failing to address fundamental questions of economic justice and fairness and the dignity of work.
Well, I think what the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton missed is that point. I mean, if you want to be a president, you have to respect them and show them how much you respect, and they have the dignity, as you said. Well, it seems that the essential elements of the book and your philosophy is we have to restore the civic virtue, common good, and civic republicanism and self-government. It's all very precious elements of our society and our community. But come to think of civil republicanism, they have contributed to the racial, gender, and religious discrimination throughout American history. So how can we make sure that civic republicanism does not work like that or differently at this time?
Well, as you point out, and as I show in the book, Democracy's Discontent, like any political tradition, the civic republican tradition has come to the aid of dark and dangerous political causes. That historically, those who defended slavery sometimes argued on racist terms, not everyone is equipped to be a citizen. They, the plantation class, were the ones who had the virtue that equipped them to rule and to govern, and that their African American slaves did not. So in a way, they were invoking the civic republican tradition in defense of slavery. That shows why we need, as an alternative, the liberal conception of freedom. So I think it's important to recognize that both the Republican and the liberal conceptions of freedom have, in different historical moments, come to the aid of unjust policies and law. The liberal conception of freedom also, for example, when the first pro-labor laws were enacted by states in the early 20th century, there were defenders of the liberal philosophy who said, no, these violate freedom of contract. So here was an example of the liberal conception of freedom being used, and it was used by the US Supreme Court to strike down laws establishing minimum wages and maximum hours of work, neglecting, of course, the power imbalance between the employer's freedom and the worker, who had very few alternatives. So what these examples bring out is both the Republican tradition and the liberal tradition have been invoked historically in support of unjust laws and policies and practices. So for any political tradition, I think we have to evaluate the tradition for the philosophy, in this case, the philosophy of freedom that it advances. But it's always a further question how that conception of freedom is applied in practice. And that too will involve political debate and disagreement.
Some people say that reading after this type of the philosophy books, and they say it's a good read, but how can you apply this to our everyday life? So could you please tell us how we can restore those very precious values like civic virtue, common good, civic republican tradition, and also self-government after reading your book?
I think the new edition of this book, Democracy's Discontent, looks back at the dangers democracy is facing today. In many countries, many democratic societies, citizens are frustrated with the empty terms of political debate. We see threats to democracy. And so I think it's important to try to understand the source of that threat, which I trace to a widespread discontent among citizens, a sense of disempowerment, a sense that our voices don't matter. And so I at least hope, Ji-yoon, to put before us as democratic citizens the question, how can we do better? How can we address democracy's discontent by recovering our voice as democratic citizens, by reasoning together, deliberating about big questions that matter, and also by learning to listen to those from different backgrounds, different life experiences, learning to listen to those with whom we disagree. I think asking these questions is the only way that we will begin to address the threat that democracy faces in so many countries around the world today.
Well, there's people who actually say you're writing this book because now we cannot really trust the American type of democracy, etc. But I actually read the book and also interpreted your argument that you really want to save the democracy.
Yeah. I don't want to suggest that American democracy has all the answers, but what I do want to suggest, and in this book try to do, is to show that American democracy has struggled with its imperfections for a very long time. And I want to look at the moral and civic resources that have been brought to bear in addressing the discontents and the imperfections and the sometimes failures of American democracy in hopes that these moral and civic resources can possibly be relevant to other societies as they struggle with redeeming the promise of democracy in the light of their traditions, and their hopes and their aspirations. Ji-yoon.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight. Do you have any plan to visit Korea anytime soon?
I don't have any definite plans, but I am very much looking forward to returning to Korea. I've missed my visits to Korea, which I have always found energizing and inspiring.
You know, you're a rockstar philosopher, so we are waiting for you to come.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ji-yoon. I very much look forward to it, and I'm very grateful for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sandel. Thank you. Bye-bye.